Well, welcome to the North American Carbon World Session, Offsets and New Horizons, the Unique Opportunities and Challenges for Blue Carbon. I'm delighted to moderate our expert panel, Amy Schmid representing Verra, and Sydney Chamberlain representing the Nature Conservancy. First of all, Amy and Sydney and I would like to set some goals for this. Is that too late? Is this fitting back? Okay. We'd like to set some goals of what we would like to accomplish at this session. 1, background about the voluntary carbon credit market, IPCC, registries, developers, and brokers, as it would affect the emerging blue carbon credit market. 2, background about the opportunities, as an example, outside the carbon markets, to scale blue carbon projects. 3, better understanding the future potential of the blue carbon solutions broadly, both with and without carbon markets, current status, project eligibility, and financing. 4, challenges to scaling up blue carbon projects, such as complex methodologies, lack of data, financial challenges, and potential solutions, such as streamlining measures. And 5, climate policy, challenges to accelerate blue carbon projects. That's a lot to accomplish. I hope we do that. My name's Phil Cruver, and I'm representing KZO Sea Farms. I started KZO Sea Farms 10 years ago. It was to develop fish farms, aquaculture farms in developing countries, and also mariculture parks. But then I got diverted. In 2012, KZO Sea Farms received the first offshore permit for developing an aquaculture facility in U.S. federal waters. What does that mean? It was off of the coast, it was 6 miles off the coast of Huntington Beach. And if you're 3 miles within the state area, it's state waters, and that's governed in California by the much feared California Coastal Commission. But because we were 6 miles out, the sole jurisdictions with the Army Corps of Engineers. So anyway, we got the first permit. But then I formed a company called Catalina Sea Ranch, and we developed a 100-acre mussel ranch, and we had a permit for macrocystis kelp. So that's kind of the background of my aquaculture interest. But then the next step that happened is in 2018, Catalina Sea Ranch got a contract with the Department of Energy to develop a macroalgae industry in the United States. That was a $25 million project, and thank you, taxpayers in this room, for making your contribution. The next step for my background is last year I was retained by the Inter-American Development Bank to develop a seaweed industry and supply chain for exports from Belize. They had a very nascent, small co-op of women that were growing seaweed. Through my research, I discovered the most astonishing fact that the $10 billion hydrocolloid business, mostly in Asia, started with the Philippines, goes to Indonesia, and all around the globe. But it's completely artisanal. So 30 years they've been around, and they're still in the primitive stage of going out, planting propagules with their hands, then harvesting with their hands. There's been absolutely no automation. So I saw a great opportunity to automate and reimagine the tropical sea plant industry. So that's my background, and I'm really interested about the potential of blue carbon credits as it may apply to, I call it, by the way, not seaweed. Weed has a pejorative connotation, not good for branding ingredients, so I call it sea plants. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to have Amy talk about her background and also about what Verra does.
Thanks, and it's great to be speaking with all of you today. So I'm Amy Schmid, and I'm the manager of Blue Carbon Innovation at Verra. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Verra, we're a standard-setting organization. So we develop and manage standards for climate change mitigation and sustainable development benefits, including our flagship program, the Verified Carbon Standard, or VCS. So my role with Blue Carbon Innovation is to work with our tidal wetland conservation and restoration activities, and also work with some more emerging work in ocean and marine-based activities, exploring how, whether and how they could be supported by voluntary carbon finance. So I thought it might be useful to kind of give an overview of what is blue carbon from our perspective. And so currently, when we talk about blue carbon, we're usually talking about tidal wetland conservation and restoration, so working in tidal wetland ecosystems, including mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marsh. And then, as Phil was kind of referring to, there's a lot of interest in newer types of ocean and marine-based activities, including seaweed farming, and I feel like I hear about new activities every single week, so there's kind of a huge list of potential things that could have a climate change benefit in the ocean. But we really see those as more emerging activities or potential activities that we're looking into, but that aren't currently covered by carbon methodologies or carbon markets. And so finally, one of the pieces of work that we've been involved with, because we know about the importance of our ocean ecosystems, both for their carbon benefits and also their many non-carbon benefits, has been to look into how to scale up action in this area. And so one of the things I'm looking forward to talking with this group about is some of the challenges and opportunities that we see for blue carbon ecosystems, both our tidal wetlands and some of these more emerging ocean activities. And we at Verra, we've worked with a working group of about 15 technical experts for the past 2 years to really be looking into these areas. And so I'm excited to be able to kind of continue the conversation in a bit about some of these challenges and opportunities and tell you all a bit more about blue carbon.
Thank you, Amy. Sydney, you want to talk about yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, and thank you all for being here. I have to just say, it is really exciting to actually talk to people in 3 dimensions and see you in a room instead of just a number of names on Zoom. So thanks to all of you for coming. My name is Sydney Chamberlain. I'm a project manager for climate and nature-based solutions with the Nature Conservancy based in California. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the Nature Conservancy, or TNC for short, we are a global environmental nonprofit working to protect the lands and waters on which all life depends. And as you can imagine, climate change poses a huge threat to our mission. So we're working around the clock to develop robust, science-based solutions that can help us create a future where people and nature can thrive together. TNC has been an innovator in terrestrial carbon solutions, and we also have expertise in a broad array of different management interventions and funding mechanisms, including through partnerships with governments, local communities, industry in the private sector, and communities. And one of the best cases for blue carbon is through projects on the ground, and we're heavily involved in that space. TNC has coastal restoration and conservation projects underway in California, across the U.S., and globally, including in places like Mexico, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea, among others. So it's a really exciting space. My own work, I actually focus very specifically on California, so my role focuses on thinking about the ways that we can accelerate and scale the use of nature-based solutions here in California, including blue carbon systems. And I have to say, one of the exciting things about working on climate policy in California is that California is kind of like a living laboratory for policy, so it's a really great place to understand. If you want to think about how to scale and accelerate solutions, this is the laboratory where you can learn how to do it. So looking forward to sharing all this and discussing with this great group.
Thank you. And what we'd like to do is do a question and answer here with the panel and then open it up to the audience to ask questions. So to start off, for Amy, I got a question for you, Amy. What's the status of the mangroves, seagrasses, and marshes blue carbon credits project? And what are some of the challenges and opportunities related to scaling up blue carbon project development?
Yeah, so we currently under the VCS program have 3 methodologies that are approved, and collectively they cover tidal wetland conservation and restoration activities anywhere in the world where those tidal ecosystems exist. We have a handful of projects that have registered and issued credits. All of them are focusing on either mangrove restoration or conservation. And we also have a handful of projects that are under development or currently undergoing the validation process. And again, most of them are focused on mangroves, though we do have a seagrass project that should be coming online soon based in Virginia, actually being led by TNC. And so compared to some of the other nature-based solutions that we've seen, we have relatively few blue carbon projects, and one of the challenges that they face is that they're also pretty small scale compared to terrestrial forest projects, for example. And so in terms of the volume of credits in the market, it's pretty low, and so that can be kind of a challenge for those that are interested in using blue carbon to offset their emissions, but it also represents a real opportunity for helping to scale up these activities because there is this kind of huge potential opportunity for selling credits. But in terms of challenges, we, like I mentioned, have been working with a group of experts to identify some of the challenges that blue carbon projects face in terms of like bringing them or scaling them up. And so I'll go through a few. The first is kind of related to the ecosystem and the complexity of the ecosystem. So wetlands, by their nature, are connected to other ecosystems, and projects need to take into account the water that's flowing through them and the potential downstream impacts that a project activity could be having. In terms of both restoration and conservation activities, it's key to understand what the driver of degradation could be. So this should be familiar for any of you who work with terrestrial forest conservation, looking at drivers of deforestation and degradation. But for restoration projects in the terrestrial sense, you normally don't have to think about those drivers of degradation. However, for wetlands, oftentimes they're not occurring in the project site. It might be an upstream impact that's having that land use conversion in the project area. So something like water quality, sediment loading, or water temperature that's having this impact. So one of the challenges is being able to figure out what those drivers of degradation actually are, and then being able to address them, especially if they're not occurring on site. Another challenge is that blue carbon projects can be just more complex in terms of their quantification. So when you're looking at them, you can look at above ground biomass, and the largest carbon stock will be in the soil. But there's also potential emissions from the soil that occur in the project scenario, especially with restoration activities in certain cases. And so there's also a lack of data in a lot of cases about what those emissions could look like. And so instead of being able to use kind of peer-reviewed data or a government source of data, projects are often needing to go and do soil monitoring to see how many emissions could be occurring, which adds some additional burden to the project. And finally, a big challenge that we see that I'll cover now is related to the financing. So these projects, because of their complexity and the need to address kind of many things in relation to other types of NBS, can have a really high upfront cost for project development. And so even though there's this really high demand for blue carbon credits, there's kind of a mismatch between where the finance is available for verified credits and when it's really needed to get a project off the ground.
And Sydney, what's the Nature Conservancy doing?
So there's a lot happening in this space, and we are a big organization. So I'm just going to try to kind of capture a little bit of the bigger picture, and then I'm going to pivot and talk about a little bit about California, because I'm biased and I want to tell you about the work we're doing here. So, TNC has done a lot of projects recently that harness innovative financing mechanisms to help support conservation. We have a new effort underway called Blue Bonds for Ocean Conservation, and the idea there is to help support island and coastal nations in reinvesting in their natural resources by helping them to refinance a portion of their national debt and create a finance stream that can support conservation work. So that's something that's going on in countries like Seychelles and Belize and other places. My colleagues have also been exploring the ways that we can use innovative crediting systems, so combining carbon offsets with a new concept called resilience credits, and that would generate new private investment streams. And that idea is based on really harnessing the synergy that exists within blue carbon ecosystems between mitigation and adaptation. So that's kind of a snapshot of the global picture. But I want to tell you a little bit about what we're doing in California, because we have work happening on the ground, and that's really an important place for us to learn about how we can scale these efforts elsewhere. So here in California, we're developing an offset for the voluntary market, and it's a place called Staten Island, not to be confused with New York. This is Staten Island, California. It's in an area called the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, and I know there's a lot of folks here who aren't from California, so just to kind of give you some context, This is a region that's really, really important, both from a biodiversity and habitat perspective and also an infrastructure perspective. So it's an area where the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers come together and the water mixes and then it meets tidal flows from the San Francisco Bay. And it's become a really important region for agriculture, but it's also a really important stop on the Pacific Flyway, and it's also a source of major water supplies where I think more than 2/3 of Californians get their fresh water supplies through the California Delta. So a really important region. TNC owns this piece of property, this Staten Island property, and what we're doing is what we call a mosaic agricultural operation. And I use the word mosaic because we're pairing a couple things together. We're actually pairing wetland restoration with agricultural practices, and in this case, climate-friendly and wildlife-friendly ag. And so the idea is we're taking 4,000 acres of corn crops and converting them to rice. This creates greenhouse gas benefits, it creates habitat benefits for migratory birds, and it stops ground subsidence, which is a huge issue threatening water infrastructure in the Delta. And then adjacent to this corn crop conversion project, we're restoring 1,000 acres of wetland. So collectively, the wetland restoration and the crop conversion comprise one single offset project. Or will be an offset project. We're in the process of registering that project with the American Carbon Registry using their California Deltaic and Coastal Wetland restoration methodology. And it's a pretty new methodology. I'm not sure, at least to my knowledge, I don't think any credits have yet been sold with that methodology. So we'll be, if not one of the first to sell credits for that. And this is an important project for a couple of reasons. One is that it gives us a chance to learn how can we scale and accelerate solutions like this in other coastal ecosystems in California and beyond. It's also important because it serves as an on-the-ground proof of concept, and our hope is that we can help to use it to advocate for California to adopt a compliance protocol for wetland restoration. So I know that was a lot, but just kind of a snapshot of some of the work we're doing.
Back to you, Amy. What would be the roadmap, cost, and time for certifying sea plants and kelp? And what would it take for shellfish, let's just say mussels and oysters, to become eligible?
Right, so this is kind of the big question right now. So we've heard so much interest in different ocean-based activities like seaweed farming, kelp conservation and restoration, and others like avoided bottom trawling, sediment management, and even things like ocean alkalinity enhancement. And one of the big questions that we have is, when is the scientific understanding enough and sufficient to really be able to support a carbon methodology and resulting carbon credits? And so this is an area that we want to look into, and we are looking into through engagement with an initiative called the Seascape Carbon Initiative. And we're working with a few other organizations with the ultimate goal of being able to identify which ocean-based activities are most promising for carbon credit generation and catalyze the ability of the voluntary carbon markets to support those activities. But I have to say, right now we're at a pretty early stage. So we're looking into different activities, working with some research groups to see where the science is at, hearing from different research groups kind of different opinions on where that may be and which activities might be best or kind of most promising for carbon crediting. And then we're also starting to think through kind of what are the other questions that we need to think about. So we know for nature-based solutions that it's never just about the carbon. We need to also think about any potential unintended negative impacts on native ecosystems, the permanence of the emission reductions or removals that result from the activities, and also how to monitor kind of like long-term carbon stocks. So for those of you who are just hearing about seaweed, the idea is that pieces of seaweed will break off, and some of that will end up into the deep ocean as dissolved or particulate organic carbon. And once it gets there, it represents a long-term carbon store. But the question is, you can't go back to your seaweed farm or your kelp forest and measure that carbon stock. It's ended up somewhere off-site. So that's another kind of big question that we need to figure out. And then, of course, there's kind of like additional questions about the legality of claiming a carbon credit from a carbon stock that's somewhere in the deep ocean, either in national waters or potentially in international waters. So there's quite a bit to think through from kind of a carbon or greenhouse gas program perspective. But like I said, we are looking into this, and we're working with a few great organizations to help us think through this. And also we're hoping to be able to engage with kind of a much broader group of stakeholders as we start to move this work forward. But I don't know if I have a great answer to your specific question about the roadmap, time, and costs, because I'm not sure if we have enough information to really know what that is yet. So other than to say, we're thinking about it and we're working on it, but maybe if we talk about this again in a year's time, we'll have a better sense of the roadmap.
Thank you. Back to Sydney. Amy just touched on some of the challenges around methodologies and protocols. Can you speak to some of the other challenges surrounding blue carbon credits or projects, and how can climate policies tackle these challenges?
Yeah, I can turn this on. Thanks, Phil. That's a great question. So I'm glad that Amy's taken the really hard side of the science questions, but of course there's policy challenges too, and other challenges in how we think about scaling these projects, right? So as we talk about this, I think we can keep the bigger picture in mind. I know this is blue carbon session, but this is an opportunity for us to look to nature-based solutions as a whole and think about, as we've implemented these kinds of solutions, like improved forest management, for example, what can we learn from those solutions and apply to blue carbon? So, a couple challenges jump to my mind, and they're things that were mentioned earlier today. There was a panel on natural climate solutions, and I think Deputy Secretary Hansen mentioned a couple of these challenges too. But funding, of course, is like the first thing that pops into my mind, and maybe your mind too. It's just a huge challenge for these projects and for nature-based solutions as a whole. So we need to see increased investment for these solutions, both from the private sector and from the public sector. And this is an area where policy can definitely help, because we can create policies that help to incentivize multi-benefit solutions, which nature-based solutions and blue carbon fundamentally are multi-benefit solutions. So, the big question is, how do we elevate the role of these solutions in policy? One thing that we can really help to do to drive action is to urge governments to adopt targets and goals for nature, or in terms of California, we call it our natural and working lands sector, which is kind of a mouthful. But we know that goals and targets drive action, right? And that's something that TNC is actively engaged in here in California, both through advocacy in the regulatory space and through legislative action. So we're really pushing on California to try to get it to adopt a goal for its natural and working lands sector. Another way that we can use policy to help is by harnessing better alignment between different sectors. So, we have all this climate action underway, right, with transportation, with energy, we've got natural and working lands, and we just need to see better alignment. And I think this is an area where, earlier I mentioned how California can be kind of a laboratory for policy. I think we have a great example here. California has set really ambitious targets to reduce vehicle miles traveled in the state, which is basically a proxy for transportation emissions. And at the same time, the state has a really bad housing crisis. So there's constantly conversation underway about where and when and how do we site new housing developments. If you pair that with natural and working lands and nature-based solutions like blue carbon, we have an opportunity to align action so that we can think about conservation as a complement to our transportation emission reduction strategies and to our housing strategies. And there's some really great examples where we've seen nature-based solutions like wetland restoration in California actually be catalyzed through alignment with other sectors like transportation. Another challenge beyond funding, though, that comes up, especially in blue carbon and for wetlands in particular, is permitting. And we've talked with partners on the ground, folks who are implementing coastal wetland projects here in California, where it's taken them 3, 4, 5 years to get the permits in place to start the work. And that's a problem when we talk about being in the critical decade for climate action, but it's going to take you 4 years to get your permit. So the time is part of the challenge, and then the cost is part of the challenge, because permits cost money. And if you're a landowner who wants to get, started on a wetland restoration project and you need funding, if you get that funding from a government source and you've got to go through that permitting process, that's going to dramatically increase the amount you've got to get. So that's an issue too. And so we're hoping to find ways with policy that we can streamline some of these permitting challenges. And right now the state of California is committed to a new initiative that they're calling Cutting the Green Tape. I'm not sure what's in it yet, but we're hoping that that's something that can help to streamline some of these efforts.
And before we move to the next question, I would just really echo kind of the challenge associated with permitting. So the project that TNC is developing in Virginia is a seagrass restoration project, and they actually needed to work with the state government to have legislation passed for them to be able to claim the carbon credits from this activity due to the state's kind of control of the seabed. And so in the U.S., it's that states have that control. So one of the questions is, how do we get around needing to go on that state-by-state journey of passing legislation? But also looking kind of more globally, in most countries, at least one, and in some more than one government agency has control over coastal wetlands and tidal wetlands. So working with the government is really important in those cases, but also can represent a challenge because it's an additional step that project developers need to kind of think about and go through.
And sorry, Phil, I thought what you said just reminded me of one other thing I wanted to mention. You know, again, there's an opportunity to learn with blue carbon from other nature-based solutions. So in California, one of the nature-based solutions we've been tackling is ecological forest restoration. And we know wildfire is a huge problem here. So TNC has been heavily engaged in the Sierra Nevada. And we're thinking, how do you do landscape scale restoration on millions of acres of land that cut across different jurisdictions, like you were just saying, different land ownership types? That's a complex problem. And one of the ways we've started to tackle that is by developing innovative partnership frameworks where you bring together diverse partners. So our group particularly put together a partnership that included TNC, some other NGOs, state government, federal government. That diverse partnership is something that can help expedite this process because you're able to cut across those jurisdictional boundaries and also to get more diverse pool of funding. So just an addition there.
Thank you. And one final question. This would be for both Sydney and Amy. You mentioned funding and investment as potential barriers in scaling blue carbon projects. And Amy talked about the role that carbon markets can play in helping to address those. Are there other innovative mechanisms that might be able to accelerate these projects? And let's start with Sydney.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I love this question, and I think it's a great add-on to the last question. So we talked about policy as one lever to help accelerate this and get over challenges, but there are other ways we can try to catalyze investment and adoption of solutions in this space too. So when we think about blue carbon, and actually just nature-based solutions as a whole, there's really a lot of synergy between mitigation and adaptation. And particularly with blue carbon, right? You're almost always getting resilience or adaptation benefits along with your carbon mitigation. And so an interesting way to think about this is in terms of risk reduction. We know that blue carbon systems, or blue carbon ecosystems, can protect communities from disasters and from climate impacts like storm surges. And in reducing climate risk communities, there's an opportunity to connect these projects to insurance as a way to help catalyze increased investment and adoption of these solutions. So let me give you an example, because I know just throwing insurance at you at the end of the afternoon can be a lot. In 2005, there were 2 hurricanes that hit the Caribbean coast of Mexico. They caused $8 billion of damage. They closed hotels. They caused damage to beaches. But what was found was that certain hotels and beaches were less damaged than others. And it turns out that the reason was that there was a healthy coral reef that protected those communities. Of course, coral reefs can be damaged by storms too. And so what we recognized is sort of this situation where if we protect nature, if we protect the coral reef, then that reef can help protect people. And so what TNC did is we worked with the Mexican government, the National Parks Commission, and some other stakeholders to develop an innovative and first-of-its-kind insurance policy for the coral reef itself. So normally you think about insurance, you might think, oh, I'm going to insure my car. This is an insurance policy for the natural resource itself. And the way it works is that there's a trust that collects funds that can be used to maintain the integrity of that coral reef and to send people in to repair it and restore it if there's a storm surge. And now what we're doing in California is exploring that same idea. We're doing the science right now to quantify the flood risk reduction benefits that you get from restoring salt marshes in the San Francisco Bay with the hope of connecting that to insurance. And then I know this isn't blue carbon, but in the wildfire space, we've actually spent quite a bit of time thinking about the nexus between nature-based solutions or natural infrastructure and insurance. And so we've done a lot of the groundwork there, understanding the science of the risk reduction benefits you get from nature-based tools and the way that those then can materialize into insurance benefits. Just one other idea that's similar, but that's public sector and not private sector, is to think about FEMA. So FEMA has a number of grant programs that think about hazard mitigation, both in terms of pre-disaster and post-disaster hazards. And so therein is another opportunity to think about catalyzing investment for these tools that we know can protect people and communities.
Okay, we just got the 30-minute warning. Let's take some questions from the audience. And thank you, Amy and Sydney, for, I think we met our goals. We answered those 5 questions that we started off with. How do we do this with the... Okay, please.
Well, I can start. So like I said, it can be a challenge because projects need to address that. So what we've seen from the projects that we have in Columbia and in other locations is that the project developer has worked very closely with the government and also with communities who may have land tenure or kind of traditional rights of use in the mangrove ecosystems to be able to demonstrate that they have the carbon rights. Yeah, so I don't know specifically, but I do know that for the project that we have in Columbia, that they have worked very closely with the government agencies that are involved and that they were able to resolve that. But they did have to kind of put in that effort to make sure that they're getting the result that they need in order to get carbon credits. And I think that, it is a challenge. It may not happen in all cases. So they kind of had the best case result of that from the effort that they put in. But it is something that folks would need to take into account.
Third row.
So this question is for Cindy. You're talking about this idea of insurance nature and how TNC has explored this more with wildfires and blue carbon. Would you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. Oh, I'm going to turn this on again. We have a couple projects, but I'll tell you about the one that I'm most closely connected to. Some of you may remember the Camp Fire that happened in California in 2018. And if you don't remember, this was a particular devastating fire. It remains the deadliest fire in California history. It was something like 6 a.m. when the fire was sparked, and by noon, the town was burnt down. I mean, it was just completely decimated this town of Paradise. And now Paradise is in the stages of rebuilding. And so this is a small community in the Sierra Nevada, and they're thinking, how do we rebuild in a fire-resilient way? Because what we're really learning about California is that fire is an inevitable part of our state's landscape. So as we think about that, TNC had this notion, what if instead of rebuilding on every parcel of land, you take the parcels along the perimeter of town and you use them as a space that's managed for low fire risk? We call this idea wildfire buffers. And what we did is to quantify first the science and say, well, how much ignition risk reduction does the community get from a fire that's coming nearby if we have these buffers in place? So we did science with the Conservation Biology Institute and the Paradise Recreation and Parks District to actually quantify with science what the actual risk reduction of this buffer system could be. And then the next step was we've been working with an insurance company, Marsh McLennan, to actually quantify the insurance benefits of that approach. And we just released a paper last December where we actually quantified that and showed that you get substantial risk reduction benefits. And in fact, that losses in Paradise could have been reduced by something like 40% if they'd had these buffers in place prior to the campfire. So this gives us an idea for how we can use nature and natural tools to protect people. And when you put that in terms, insurance terms or terms that the insurance industry can understand, gives them a chance to put it in their models and create new investment opportunities. And a similar example is we've done a sort of an adjacent project looking at ecological forest restoration and quantifying the risk reduction from that. And we're actually working on a brand new insurance product now that's related. So, thank you. Great question.
So you mentioned resiliency credits. Can you expand on that? Talk to us a little bit about the kind of how they would interact with carbon credits, and then also maybe an opportunity to talk about SD Vista's coastal resiliency methodology.
So I can start. So SD Vista is the Sustainable Development Verified Impact Standard, and it's another standard that Verra has developed, and it allows projects to certify claims about their contributions to the SDGs, and also provides an option for them to issue credits related to the SDGs if they want to. And so one of the first methodologies for credit issuance that's being developed by TNC is related to coastal resilience. And so the idea is that projects can certify their coastal resilience benefits, issue a credit, and that they can stack these credits with carbon credits for the blue carbon activity. Yeah, so blue carbon isn't necessarily a defined term that has the same definition for everyone. Generally, it means carbon that's coming from the ocean or tidal or coastal ecosystems. So usually when I talk about it, I think of it as either tidal wetlands, coastal wetlands, or the ocean, but I have seen where some people include inland wetlands or peatlands kind of in that definition. Not sure if Sydney has any other ideas.
No, I think that sounds about right. And I mean, like for our offset project in the Delta, it's technically a deltaic wetland. So I mean, it's kind of in the middle because you really have this large tidal freshwater estuary. So it's like somewhere in between. But we still think about it as blue carbon.
One of the challenges that I didn't hear you guys raise is the elevated risk that these projects have to changing climate, sea level rise, storm surge, etc. How do you manage that elevated risk profile for these project types without just translating it into a high discount rate that then just hinders their feasibility even more so?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's something for sea level rise for all of the blue carbon projects. It's not really a risk, it's a certainty that they'll be affected in some way by sea level rise. So within the methodologies that we have specific requirements for projects to kind of estimate the impacts of sea level rise on the project area and design either mitigation measures or plan for wetland migration as sea level rises. So there are ways to, mitigate that risk, and also these ecosystems provide a really important adaptation to that risk. But it is something that a lot of projects face, and in certain cases it's also really difficult to have kind of long-term certainty in how much sea level rise is going to impact an area. So it can be difficult, but we do have those measures to kind of plan for it, mitigate it. And something that I've also seen is kind of an idea that, not necessarily from a project development standpoint, but maybe from a credit buyer's standpoint, that you could bundle together multiple projects in different locations, and then you're kind of de-risking the group of projects, even though each individual project may have, a certain level of risk. So those are some ideas, but sea level rise is definitely a challenge for these types of projects. Yeah, so I think what we've heard, since we're not directly involved in investment between projects and investors, but what we've heard from projects is that a lot of times investors want to invest in a carbon project that they have a certain certainty is going to have a certain level of benefit. So basically, they're interested in a carbon project that has come up with kind of an idea of their estimated emission reductions and removals that they'll generate. But because of kind of the complexity, a lot needs to go into a project in terms of designing it, taking measurements, to actually get to the point where you could have some certainty about your estimated greenhouse gas benefit. So we're really seeing that a lot of funding is needed for that very early stage of feasibility for, could this be a carbon project? Does it make sense to develop as a carbon project when the investment really won't come until they have that certainty?
Any more questions? Audience, okay.
Yeah, so I'm very passionate about this, untapped potential here, and I used to work at the Climate Action Reserve, so I have understanding of the methodology, development process, works, but Amy, I'd really like to phrase it, how much more we have to wait for the science, come to understand the science before we really tap into this. So I'm curious if you speak to any more like kind of flexibility that can be brought into the methodology development process where we hit a certain
Yeah, so with some of the newer activity types like seaweed, we're really thinking that kind of the first methodologies that are developed will probably be extremely conservative. So like you said, kind of having this idea of, we know that there's a benefit and we're going to do what we can to not overestimate that. And then as we get more information, can revise the methodology to kind of make it a little bit more accurate, a little bit less conservative, so that projects could get more credits, assuming that they're actually generating that benefit. So I think that's one idea. Another idea is potentially having models within the methodologies. So especially for some of these kind of new emerging activity types where you're not going to be able to go to a certain site and measure a carbon stock and the carbon is ending up somewhere else. So having models based on research that's been done, about the amount of carbon that ends up there, how long is it going to stay, and again, at the beginning, really probably going with a conservative estimate. So those are some of the ideas for kind of those emerging areas. We also are working with our existing blue carbon methodologies to streamline them where we can, especially for small scale activities, since many tidal wetland projects are pretty small scale. And many times that's due just to the nature of the ecosystem. You have kind of a narrow strip of mangroves along the coast or a tidal wetland along the coast, and you can't make it bigger because you just have that much of the kind of appropriate area for them. So we are thinking about, what can we do from kind of a methodology side to make it streamlined without impacting the rigor. And then for new activities, thinking of, probably a conservative approach to start out with so that we can get methodologies out there and get funding into those activities, since we all know it's pretty urgent to solve the climate crisis.
Any more questions? Well, audience, thank you for your attention, and Amy and Sydney, you are awesome.